In the dense, humid skies over North Vietnam, a small group of elite pilots flew into danger with no guarantee they would return. They were not ordinary airmen. They were Misty, a covert, hand-picked squadron of volunteers tasked with one of the most hazardous missions of the Vietnam War, to spot and mark enemy targets from low altitudes, deep within hostile territory, where anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles filled the air like deadly confetti. Their goal was not to destroy, it was to see, to uncover the hidden arteries of war supply trucks, ammunition convoys, fuel depots, all flowing through the jungle-covered veins of the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. And to do this, they had to fly low, fast, and often alone. This was not just a mission, it was a gamble. Over 30% of Misty pilots were shot down, some were captured, some never returned. Yet these men, knowing the risks, volunteered. Why? Because they believed the mission mattered. Because they wanted to make a difference in a war shaped more by politics than strategy. As the Vietnam War escalated, the Misty Squadron became the eyes of the air campaign. They flew jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft, identifying targets for strike teams, often guiding bombers in real time, flying just hundreds of feet above ground, through narrow valleys and mountain passes. They faced relentless enemy fire, day after day. Their efforts helped expose a truth the enemy tried desperately to hide, that the North Vietnamese were not just guerrillas sneaking through the jungle. They were a disciplined, organized military force, moving entire battalions and tons of supplies southward in broad daylight. The Misty pilots made it their mission to disrupt that flow, one convoy at a time. But their story is not just about war tactics. It is about courage under fire, brotherhood among aviators, and the haunting cost of duty. It is about young men who believed in something larger than themselves, who flew through flak and fear not for glory, but for each other. In this video, we will uncover the untold history of the Misty pilots, their daring missions, the technology they used, the politics that restrained them, and the legacy they left behind. It is a story of innovation, grit, and sacrifice, hidden behind the clouds of a forgotten war. If you are fascinated by real-life stories of bravery, history, and human resilience, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these powerful stories alive and share them with the world. And do not forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in this incredible journey through history. They flew through walls of flak, past tracer fire that lit up the sky like lightning trapped in a bottle, and over jungles so thick they seemed to breathe. The Misty pilots, sharp-eyed, steel-nerved, and relentlessly committed, risked everything to spot enemy supply movements and guide strike aircraft onto targets. And yet, as deadly and courageous as their missions were, a frustrating truth loomed over every flight: the most effective targets, the lifelines that truly fed the war effort, were off limits. In the briefings before each sortie, Misty pilots studied maps, photographs, and intelligence reports detailing the North Vietnamese logistics network. They knew precisely where the supply ships offloaded their cargo at bustling ports in Haiphong and along the coastline north of the demilitarized zone. They knew where power plants provided the electricity that kept radar systems and anti-aircraft defenses humming. And they knew which railway hubs served as crucial arteries in the enemy's vast transport system. These were the beating hearts of the North Vietnamese war machine. The Misty pilots were trained to find the veins and arteries connected to them. But orders were orders. Despite the clarity of their intelligence and the urgency of their missions, Misty crews were barred from striking those strategic nodes. These were not military decisions made by field commanders, but political calculations handed down from far away, crafted in secure rooms, thousands of miles from the jungle. The fear, always looming, was that bombing these sensitive targets might provoke a response from China, whose entry into the Korean War 2 decades earlier had taught U.S. leaders a painful lesson in escalation. And so the Misty pilots were told to fly around the problem, to ignore the ports and railways, and focus instead on the trucks already deep into the supply chain, individual targets that were difficult to spot, protected by thick canopies, and often dispersed along hidden trails winding through Laos and Cambodia. This doctrine, sometimes called gradualism, assumed that limited pressure would compel the enemy to negotiate, but to the pilots in the sky, it felt like swatting at shadows, while the source of the darkness remained untouched. Flying these missions took more than skill, it took belief. And that belief was tested every time a Misty pilot watched a truck burn on the trail, knowing that 10 more had already passed days earlier, undisturbed, from the very locations they were forbidden to strike. It was tested when friends were lost, their aircraft shot down in enemy territory while hunting targets far less critical than those left untouched. The war, they realized, was not just being fought in the skies or on the ground. It was also being shaped, confined, and diluted by politics. And yet they kept flying. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not just a path. It was a vast, shifting ecosystem of routes, bridges, and rest stops. Camouflaged by treetops and protected by surface-to-air missile sites, it pulsed with life during the night and vanished into stillness by day. The Misty crews became experts at reading the subtle clues, a line of crushed vegetation suggesting hidden tire tracks, the telltale glint of metal through foliage, the strange shape of what was supposed to be a tree. Their aerial ballet required them to fly low and fast, too low for safety, too fast for comfort, and all while being hunted by enemy gunners with practiced hands and eyes sharpened by years of war. They used white phosphorus rockets to mark targets and coordinated with strike aircraft, often guiding bombs in underfire. But every successful mission was haunted by the knowledge that they were dancing at the edge of a strategy that never truly reached the enemy's core. One pilot compared it to trying to cut down a tree by picking off its leaves. The trunk, the ports, the factories, the command centers stood untouched, shielded by political caution. Still, they adapted. When the rules blocked one route, they mapped out another. When roads were off limits, they focused on trails. When they could not stop the trucks at the source, they disrupted them mid-journey. But the toll was high. For the enemy, replacing a burned truck was easier than replacing a downed pilot. And with each mission, the Misty crews were reminded that they were trading lives for glimpses of progress in a war that increasingly felt like it was being managed rather than won. It was not that their efforts were futile. Far from it. They disrupted supply chains, forced the enemy to change tactics, and made daylight movement nearly impossible. Their work gave U.S. forces on the ground a fighting chance, and bought time in a conflict that offered few certainties. But even as they succeeded in their limited scope, many could not shake the feeling that they were being used as tools in a strategy designed more to avoid political fallout than to achieve military victory. Years later, many Misty veterans would reflect on this duality. The pride in their service lived alongside the frustration of knowing what could have been done. Had the leash been loosened just slightly, they were not reckless. They did not want to widen the war. But they had seen the map. They had the intelligence. They had the aircraft. What they did not have was permission. And so they flew the missions anyway, not out of obedience, but out of duty. Not because they believed every strike would end the war, but because they knew someone had to be in the sky, watching, marking, pushing back the night one truck at a time. That was the Misty creed. Even if the war's architects would not let them cut down the tree, they would still shake its branches until the very end. While the roar of jet engines and the chatter of radio transmissions filled the skies over Vietnam, there was a particular kind of silence that surrounded one small group of pilots, a silence not of presence, but of deliberate design. The Misty unit did not just fly some of the most dangerous missions in the war. They did so cloaked in secrecy, so profound that even other airmen sharing the same bases often had no idea what these men were doing or where they were going. They departed quietly, flew without fanfare, and returned when they could, carrying stories they were not allowed to tell, wounds they could not explain, and a growing sense that they were living in a world apart, within a war that was already strange enough. This was not just the usual confidentiality of military operations. Misty was something else entirely. From the very beginning, it was designated a top-secret test group, its official title, Commando. Sabre formed under a shroud of ambiguity, with orders spoken in whispers and operations omitted from official logs. Pilots who joined were selected through a process more like recruitment for a clandestine intelligence unit than a traditional squadron. Once inside, they entered a different kind of war, one measured not just in missions flown, but in the weight of the silence they were expected to carry. Even among fellow aviators stationed at Phu Cat or Tui Hoa air bases, Misty pilots stood out, though not in the way one might expect. They were not allowed to explain what they did or why they looked so worn after just a few flights. They could not discuss the strange flight paths or why their missions took them so deep into enemy territory with so few resources. The standard response when asked what they flew was a vague, Fast FAC work and little else. To those on the outside, it might have sounded like another routine task, but to those in the know, it was an unspoken acknowledgement of something much more dangerous. Inside Misty, however, the secrecy bound its pilots together in ways few other units could replicate. When you are flying through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, knowing you may be shot down at any moment, and knowing that even if you survive, your mission might never be publicly acknowledged, the bond with your wingman becomes more than tactical. It becomes existential. Every mission was flown with a partner, front and back seat, watching each other's blind spots, guiding each other through the maze of anti-aircraft fire and mountainous terrain. Trust was not optional. It was survival. But this secrecy also came with a price. While Misty pilots were busy threading the needle between political restrictions and physical danger, they were also carrying a burden few could see. When one of their own went missing, there were no formal announcements, no base-wide briefings. Sometimes even the rescue efforts had to be disguised or delayed, depending on where the aircraft went down. And when they returned from missions, there was no place to unload the images burned into memory. The columns of smoke, the tracer rounds curving up from the jungle, the voice of a fellow pilot fading from the radio mid-sentence. Over time, that sense of isolation deepened. Misty pilots developed their own language, their own rituals, their own map of the war. They knew which valleys were more dangerous than they looked, which ridgelines concealed anti-aircraft guns, and which times of day gave you a few precious seconds of reduced visibility. They trained their eyes to detect subtle variations in the jungle canopy, because trucks, when camouflaged well, did not disappear entirely. They simply pretended to be trees. And Misty pilots, with what they called Misty eyes, learned to tell the difference. To outsiders, they may have seemed reckless or even obsessed. There were those who could not understand why anyone would volunteer for such a role, especially knowing that over 30% of Misty pilots would be shot down. But to the men inside, the danger was not the point, it was the purpose. In a war where too many decisions were made from conference rooms far removed from the front lines, Misty was about doing something that mattered. It was about using their skills not just to survive, but to shape the battle. One target, one trail, one mission at a time. Their work was invisible by design, and yet it was among the most impactful. They disrupted convoys that were otherwise invisible to satellites and radar. They forced the North Vietnamese to change tactics, conceal movements, and build elaborate decoys. Misty missions did not win the war, but they made it harder for the enemy to wage it. And they did so under the constant weight of rules they could not challenge, in skies they were not always allowed to enter, over targets they were not allowed to hit. Years later, many Misty veterans would admit that the loneliness of their role did not fade with time. It lingered, Even after the war ended and the secrecy was lifted, there remained a strange gap between what they had done and how it was understood by the world. Most Americans had never heard of Misty. Their families often never knew the full extent of their missions. And yet, within that silence, there was pride, not loud, not boastful, but firm. They had done their job. They had flown into the unknown, not for glory, but because someone had to see what others could not. And in the shadows of a war shaped by politics and press conferences, the Misty pilots carved out a legacy built not on headlines, but on quiet, relentless action. They were the eyes above the trail, the unseen guardians in the sky, and the ones who bore the silence so that others could speak more freely. While the roar of jet engines and the chatter of radio transmissions filled the skies over Vietnam, there was a particular kind of silence that surrounded one small group of pilots, a silence not of presence, but of deliberate design. The Misty unit did not just fly some of the most dangerous missions in the war. They did so cloaked in secrecy, so profound, that even other airmen sharing the same bases often had no idea what these men were doing or where they were going. They departed quietly, flew without fanfare, and returned when they could, carrying stories they were not allowed to tell, wounds they could not explain, and a growing sense that they were living in a world apart, within a war that was already strange enough. This was not just the usual confidentiality of military operations. Misty was something else entirely. From the very beginning, it was designated a top-secret test group, its official title, Commando, saber formed under a shroud of ambiguity, with orders spoken in whispers and operations omitted from official logs. Pilots who joined were selected through a process more like recruitment for a clandestine intelligence unit than a traditional squadron. Once inside, they entered a different kind of war, one measured not just in missions flown, but in the weight of the silence they were expected to carry. Even among fellow aviators stationed at Phu Cat or Tui Hoa air bases, Misty pilots stood out, though not in the way one might expect. They were not allowed to explain what they did or why they looked so worn after just a few flights. They could not discuss the strange flight paths or why their missions took them so deep into enemy territory with so few resources. The standard response when asked what they flew was a vague, fast FAC work and little else. To those on the outside, it might have sounded like another routine task, but to those in the know, it was an unspoken acknowledgement of something much more dangerous. Inside Misty, however, the secrecy bound its pilots together in ways few other units could replicate. When you are flying through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, knowing you may be shot down at any moment, and knowing that even if you survive, your mission might never be publicly acknowledged, the bond with your wingman becomes more than tactical. It becomes existential. Every mission was flown with a partner, front and back seat, watching each other's blind spots, guiding each other through the maze of anti-aircraft fire and mountainous terrain. Trust was not optional. It was survival. But this secrecy also came with a price. While Misty pilots were busy threading the needle between political restrictions and physical danger, they were also carrying a burden few could see. When one of their own went missing, there were no formal announcements, no base-wide briefings. Sometimes even the rescue efforts had to be disguised or delayed, depending on where the aircraft went down. And when they returned from missions, there was no place to unload the images burned into memory. The columns of smoke, the tracer rounds curving up from the jungle, the voice of a fellow pilot fading from the radio mid-sentence. Over time, that sense of isolation deepened. Misty pilots developed their own language, their own rituals, their own map of the war. They knew which valleys were more dangerous than they looked, which ridgelines concealed anti-aircraft guns, and which times of day gave you a few precious seconds of reduced visibility. They trained their eyes to detect subtle variations in the jungle canopy, because trucks, when camouflaged well, did not disappear entirely. They simply pretended to be trees. And Misty pilots, with what they called Misty eyes, learned to tell the difference. To outsiders, They may have seemed reckless or even obsessed. There were those who could not understand why anyone would volunteer for such a role, especially knowing that over 30% of Misty pilots would be shot down. But to the men inside, the danger was not the point, it was the purpose. In a war where too many decisions were made from conference rooms far removed from the front lines, Misty was about doing something that mattered. It was about using their skills not just to survive, but to shape the battle. One target, one trail, one mission at a time. Their work was invisible by design, and yet it was among the most impactful. They disrupted convoys that were otherwise invisible to satellites and radar. They forced the North Vietnamese to change tactics, conceal movements, and build elaborate decoys. Misty missions did not win the war, but they made it harder for the enemy to wage it. And they did so under the constant weight of rules they could not challenge, in skies they were not always allowed to enter, over targets they were not allowed to hit. Years later, many Misty veterans would admit that the loneliness of their role did not fade with time. It lingered, even after the war ended and the secrecy was lifted. There remained a strange gap between what they had done and how it was understood by the world. Most Americans had never heard of Misty. Their families often never knew the full extent of their missions. And yet, within that silence, there was pride, not loud, not boastful, but firm. They had done their job. They had flown into the unknown, not for glory, but because someone had to see what others could not. And in the shadows of a war shaped by politics and press conferences, the Misty pilots carved out a legacy built not on headlines, but on quiet, relentless action. They were the eyes above the trail, the unseen guardians in the sky, and the ones who bore the silence so that others could speak more freely. It wound like a serpent through the mountains, disappearing beneath jungle canopies, crossing rivers in silence, then reappearing as a narrow track etched into the red earth. To the untrained eye, the Ho Chi Minh Trail looked like little more than a dirt road, but to the Misty pilots who flew above it, and to the commanders who studied it with growing concern, it was something else entirely. It was the lifeline of the war, a constantly shifting, endlessly repaired network of roads, trails, footpaths, and makeshift bridges that allowed North Vietnam to send men, weapons, and supplies deep into the south. The trail was not one road, and that was part of its genius. It was a sprawling web cutting across North Vietnam, weaving through the rugged terrain of Laos and Cambodia, and splintering into hundreds of hidden entry points into South Vietnam. From above, it seemed to vanish beneath the trees. From the ground, it came alive with movement at night. Trucks rumbled slowly along narrow passes, their lights blacked out, their cargo covered with leaves or tarps. Porters hauled ammunition on foot. Bicycles carried loads heavier than their frames were ever meant to support, and streams of soldiers marched steadily southward in the darkness. The Misty pilots understood that if the trail was allowed to function without disruption, the enemy's reach would only grow. It did not matter that high-level targets were off limits. It did not matter that political decisions kept the most valuable nodes, ports, power stations, rail junctions out of reach. The trail itself had become the war's central artery, and as long as it flowed, the battlefield could never be truly contained. Flying over it was like watching a living system adapt in real time. After every strike, the trail evolved, bomb a bridge, and a new one would appear by dawn, sometimes fashioned from bamboo or logs, crater a section of road, and teams would swarm in with shovels and bulldozers, filling it in under cover of darkness. It was not just a path, it was a statement, a declaration that no matter how much destruction rained down from above, the supply line would never break. That resilience made the Misty missions even more critical and more dangerous. Unlike high-altitude bombers, Misty pilots flew low and fast, skimming tree lines and mountain ridges, searching for fleeting evidence of movement. A flash of sunlight on metal, the smudge of exhaust curling from beneath the leaves, or a set of fresh tire tracks in the mud. They trained themselves to see the unnatural in the natural, to spot what should not be there. and mark it before it disappeared again. The enemy, in turn, adapted. The jungle became more than camouflage, it became armor. Trellises made of bamboo covered long stretches of road, blending with the canopy so well that, even from a few 100 feet above, the trail vanished. Trucks were parked under thickets during the day, then rolled out at night. Dummy vehicles were scattered across open areas to draw fire. Anti-aircraft guns, once rare in the southern stretches of the trail, became common, hidden in clearings, protected by radar, and crews with sharpened instincts. Every Misty mission over the trail was a chess match played at 400 knots. The pilots had to balance aggression with caution, instinct with calculation. Get too close to a suspected gun site, and you would find yourself dodging tracers and shrapnel. Stay too high, and you would miss the fleeting window of visibility before the jungle swallowed the target whole. Some pilots learned the rhythms of the trail so well they could predict movement based on the weather or the moon's position in the sky. Others relied on intuition, on the feeling that something just did not look right. And yet, for all their expertise, for all their courage, they knew they could only slow the flow, not stop it. The trail was too vast, too well defended, too ingeniously rebuilt. Every truck destroyed was one of many. Every convoy delayed was part of a larger wave that kept coming, night after night. But still, they flew. Not because they believed they could erase the trail, but because every disruption counted. Every fuel truck lost, every weapons shipment delayed, every supply cache exposed meant fewer resources reaching the front lines. Over time, their understanding of the trail became almost intimate. They gave nicknames to key landmarks: the Mugia Pass, the Ashau Valley, the Chapone Junction. They learned which routes were active during monsoon season and which were favored during the dry months. Some even recognized the patterns of specific convoys, tracking their movements across missions, anticipating where they might appear next. But the trail was not just a target. It was also a symbol. It represented the enemy's resolve, their ability to adapt, to hide in plain sight, to use terrain and time as weapons. It was the physical manifestation of a war that refused to fit within conventional lines. And for the Misty pilots, it became an obsession, not one born of vengeance, but of necessity. They had been given limited tools and impossible rules, and the trail was the one place where they could still make an impact. By the end of their tours, many Misty pilots could no longer look at a patch of jungle without searching for movement. The trail had imprinted itself into their vision, into their instincts. It was more than geography. It was the stage upon which they had fought a silent war, one of shadows and smoke, of flashes in the night and whispers on the radio. And though they may not have stopped it, they made it harder. They made it costlier. They forced every movement to come with risk, and in a war that was often constrained by limits and indecision, that alone was a kind of victory. They all knew the numbers. Every man who walked into that briefing room, strapped into the cockpit, or watched the mountains of North Vietnam rise beneath them as their aircraft screamed over enemy lines. It was not a mystery, and it certainly was not hidden in the fine print. Over 30% of Misty pilots would be shot down. That was the truth. And yet, the Misty squadron never had trouble finding volunteers. It was not a matter of recklessness. These were not adrenaline-chasing daredevils or young men ignorant of consequence. Many had already flown combat sorties in South Vietnam. They had seen the war from above, bombing runs, close air support, patrols over jungles that stretched for miles. And for some, it was not enough. The Misty squadron offered something different, something closer to the edge. It was where the war felt most raw, most immediate. It was where every decision could mean life or death, not just for themselves, but for the soldiers on the ground depending on them to find the enemy first. When a Misty pilot looked in the mirror before a mission, he was not pretending not to be afraid. Fear was part of the uniform. But so was purpose. And for many, that purpose burned brighter than fear. There was something magnetic about Misty. The name alone carried a kind of legend across the air bases in Vietnam. It was not officially advertised, but those in the know spoke of it with a mixture of awe and concern. The Misty Squadron was not just another assignment. It was a crucible, a test of endurance, skill, and will. Pilots who joined understood they were signing up for low-level, high-speed flights into enemy territory missions, where they were not just spotting targets, but often drawing fire so that others could strike more effectively. And still, they raised their hands. One pilot recalled that the allure was not glory. It was not even patriotism in the conventional sense. It was the challenge. The sense that, in the chaos of a war so tightly bound by politics and hesitation, Misty was one of the few places where they could truly make a difference. Up north, over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the mountain passes of Laos, it felt like the real war. Down south, pilots were often tasked with bombing suspected Viet Cong positions or supporting ground troops in isolated fire bases. But Misty was different. Misty was strategic, dangerous, necessary. The path to becoming a Misty pilot was not easy. You did not just show up. You were selected, screened, and then tested. The squadron had no room for hesitation. When you flew 500 feet above anti-aircraft nests, weaving through flak bursts and evading surface-to-air missiles, second-guessing was not just dangerous. It was fatal. The aircraft used F-100Fs, often stripped of heavy weaponry, were not built for survival under those conditions. What they lacked in armor, they made up for in speed and maneuverability. That was the Misty pilot's only protection, skill, luck, and the instinct to spot danger before it struck. And danger was everywhere. The North Vietnamese had turned their defenses into an art form. Radar-guided guns, camouflaged batteries, SAM sites buried in jungle clearings. Even teenagers, barely old enough to carry rifles, could become threats. There were pilots who made it through dozens of missions before being hit. Others did not make it past 5. Those who did get shot down often endured grueling survival, ordeals hiding in dense forests, bleeding from crash injuries, evading capture while waiting for rescue teams that might never arrive. Some were pulled out just in time. Others vanished without a trace. The knowledge that they could become one of those names, one of the lost, never left them. It lingered in the back of every pre-flight checklist, every low pass over a suspected convoy, every moment spent scanning the sky for tracers or the ground for trucks. Yet the fear never stopped them from climbing back into the cockpit. There is something haunting about that kind of determination. In conversations years later, many Misty veterans could not quite explain why they went back again and again. For some, it was about not letting the other guy down, the one sitting in the back seat, watching your six. For others, it was the sense of duty, of being part of something that mattered more than themselves. And for a few, it was simply this. They were born to fly, and Misty was the most demanding test of that calling. Those missions left a mark on the body. Yes, burns, scars, bones that never quite healed, but also on the mind. Misty pilots came home different, more introspective, less prone to exaggeration. Their stories, when told, were often quiet, measured, and filled with detail, the kind of detail that only comes from having lived 100 lives in a few dozen flights. They spoke of watching friends vanish in fireballs, of making split-second choices that determined whether someone lived or died, of the sickening silence that filled the headset when a wingman's radio went dark. And yet, none of them ever claimed to be heroes. That word rarely crossed their lips. They saw themselves as professionals, doing the job they were trained for. They acknowledged the fear, the odds, the politics, but they flew anyway, because someone had to. Because somewhere down that trail, another convoy was moving, another artillery piece was rolling south, another platoon was waiting for resupply. So they flew through monsoons and missiles, through politics and protocol, through fear and fatigue. And every time they went up, They knew the odds were against them, but still they went, because Misty was not about surviving the war. It was about doing something that mattered in the middle of it. They called them Fast FACs, forward air controllers, who flew not in slow, lumbering prop planes, but in jet aircraft, skimming treetops at speeds that blurred the jungle into streaks of green and shadow. These were the Misty pilots, and what they were doing had never really been done before, at least not like this. It was not just revolutionary, it was dangerous in a way that most missions could never match, because when you were a Misty pilot, you did not simply fly through the war, you hunted it. The mission was simple in theory, yet nearly impossible in execution. Fly low and fast over enemy territory. Identify enemy targets, trucks, artillery, supply convoys, sometimes entire underground facilities, and then direct strike aircraft to destroy them. But these targets were not waiting out in the open. They were buried beneath jungle canopies, hidden under camouflage nets, or disguised to look like natural parts of the terrain. Spotting them required more than training. It required instinct, nerves of steel, and eyes sharpened by hundreds of hours of scanning tree lines and shadowy valleys. The Misty pilots developed what they called Misty eyes, a sixth sense for finding what did not belong. Every mission started with preparation, but once in the air, plans rarely held. The skies over North Vietnam were as unpredictable as the war itself. Anti-aircraft guns could appear where they had not the day before. A clear pass through the mountains could suddenly become a death trap. The pilots had to rely not just on maps and briefings, but on their ability to read the terrain in real time, interpret subtle patterns from above, and spot fleeting signs of movement. A glint of metal, a straight line in a sea of curves, a patch of dirt slightly darker than the rest. These were clues, and the best Misty pilots could find a hidden convoy by recognizing the way leaves had been disturbed. But spotting the target was only part of the job. Once the pilot had confirmation, he had to guide the strike aircraft in. This meant staying low, marking the target with smoke rockets, white phosphorus that exploded in a cloud visible for miles and often circling the area while enemy guns zeroed in. The Misty jets became bait, and the enemy knew the game. Fire at the FAC, and you risked revealing your position, stay hidden, and the bombs would fall. It was a deadly cat and mouse, played at 500 miles per hour. Communication was everything. The Misty pilot had to coordinate with ground intel, airborne controllers, and the strike aircraft themselves. Timing mattered. So did precision. A mistake could mean bombs dropped on civilians, or a friendly unit, or nothing at all. That pressure, combined with the speed of the jet and the chaos of combat, created a workload unlike any other flying assignment. Pilots had to make decisions in seconds, each one carrying life and death consequences. There was no room for error, and yet they got good at it. Very good. The Misty Squadron became legendary, not just for its courage, but for its effectiveness. These were not lucky amateurs. They were elite aviators, using every tool at their disposal to adapt to a battlefield that changed by the hour. Their success helped define modern air control doctrine, laying the groundwork for how fast jet aircraft would be used in tactical reconnaissance and strike coordination for decades to come. They developed a rhythm. Misty pilots often flew two to a jet, a front seat and a back seat, switching roles as they rotated through missions. The front seat pilot flew the aircraft, executed the maneuvers, and delivered the smoke markers. The back-seater operated the radios, kept track of navigation, helped identify targets, and watched for threats. It was a partnership forged under fire, and many pilots would later say that the bond between Misty crewmates was unlike anything else they experienced during the war. But what made Misty truly remarkable was the fact that these pilots were rewriting the rules as they flew. There was no guidebook, no detailed doctrine. They were the test case, the experiment. The official name was Commando Sabre, a bland term masking just how radical the idea was. And it was not until the results started coming in, targets accurately identified, convoys disrupted, and enemy operations slowed, That higher command fully grasped what they had created. What they had, in truth, was a squadron of jet-powered scouts with the mindset of hunters. They were not just flying missions. They were stalking prey across one of the most heavily defended regions on Earth. And they did it without GPS, without laser-guided bombs, and often without backup. When the jets returned to base, scarred with flak damage, the pilots immediately debriefed with intelligence officers. Every detail mattered. What did the smoke look like? Did the trucks scatter? How many anti-aircraft batteries opened fire? Were there signs of new construction, new paths being cut into the jungle? The Misty pilots provided not just eyes in the sky, but minds honed to interpret patterns others might miss. Their reports became some of the most valuable intelligence in Southeast Asia. But for all their impact, the Misty pilots operated under an umbrella of secrecy. Their missions were classified. Their successes often unacknowledged outside of tight inner circles. Even other pilots sometimes did not understand what the Misty crews were doing, or why they kept flying into the most dangerous zones day after day. That isolation, combined with the physical and emotional toll, made the Misty squadron both elite and alienated. Still, they returned to the air, because in a war so often shaped by politics and limitations, Misty was one of the few places where results still mattered more than rules, where the skill of the pilot, not the caution of the policy, determined success. And though many paid the price, and more than a few were shot down, what they created, the Fast FAC doctrine, the combat vision, the relentless push into danger would echo long after the war had ended. The deeper the Misty pilots flew into North Vietnam, the more they realized they were not just battling the terrain, they were entering a living, breathing fortress. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, that winding artery of war, was not simply a path. It was a shape-shifting organism, adapting with every attack, healing after every blow. For every bomb dropped, the jungle seemed to close over the wound. Roads were rebuilt overnight, convoys rerouted before the smoke cleared. And behind it all was a defense network as cunning as it was deadly. At first glance, the jungle below looked still too still. To the untrained eye, it was a sea of green. But Misty pilots knew better. Camouflage was everywhere. Trucks were hidden under bamboo trellises, woven so tightly with foliage that even at 500 feet, you could fly right over a supply depot and never know it. From the sky, a patch of leaves might look ordinary, but something would feel off a pattern too perfect, a shadow out of place. That was the first lesson in Misty. If something does not look wrong, you are not looking hard enough. The North Vietnamese had become masters of concealment. They did not just hide their convoys. They built an entire logistical system designed to vanish. Roads were carved through triple canopy jungle. Bridges were made of logs and vines, easily dismantled and rebuilt. Fuel lines were buried, and command posts dug into hillsides. And when the Americans began flying night sorties, the enemy responded with blackout movement and false trails, laying down decoys to confuse even the sharpest eyes. But camouflage was only half the threat. The real danger came when the jungle fought back. In the early days of the war, most anti-aircraft fire came from small arms, a few bursts from rifles or machine guns that posed little threat to fast-moving jets. But by the time Misty operations were in full swing, the skies had changed. Now, as the pilots crossed the Ben Hai River into the north, they entered a gauntlet of radar-guided defenses. The roar of the jet was often followed by the thump of flak exploding nearby, or the shriek of a surface-to-air missile racing upward from a hidden launcher. The deeper they flew, the thicker the fire. AAA batteries' anti-aircraft artillery lined the ridgelines and valleys. The 37 mm and 57 mm cannons were the most common, but radar-controlled 85 mm and 100 mm guns soon followed. These were not scattered shots. They were coordinated ambushes. The moment a Misty jet appeared in a valley, multiple batteries would light up in unison, filling the sky with black bursts and spitting tracer rounds. The jets, flying low and fast, had little time to react. Evasive maneuvers were gut-level instincts, pulling hard turns at the last second, diving into clouds, banking behind hills, all while trying to stay locked on the target below. Then came the SAM surface-to-air missiles. These were game changers. Imported from the Soviet Union, the SA-2 guideline was designed to take down high-altitude bombers. But the North Vietnamese quickly adapted it to hit jets flying much lower. The missile was massive, over 30 feet long, and moved at speeds nearing Mach 3. When one was launched, it painted the sky with smoke, twisting and climbing in a slow arc before diving down toward the aircraft. Pilots had only seconds to respond. Radar warning receivers would scream in the cockpit, but often by the time the signal hit, the missile was already in the air. Pilots developed tactics, violent turns, rapid dives, beaming the radar to break lock. But sometimes, even that was not enough. Many Misty aircraft were hit. Some exploded mid-air. Others managed to limp home, riddled with holes, trailing fuel and smoke. And for every jet that made it back, another pilot did not. Yet the Misty pilots kept flying. They adapted, just as the enemy did. They studied the AAA order of battle, mapping out known gun sites and SAM zones. They learned which valleys were death traps, which ridgelines offered cover, and where to expect the worst resistance. When one site opened fire, it was marked and avoided the next day. Or sometimes it was targeted directly if weather, politics, and support aligned just right. The goal was never just to survive. It was to outsmart the defenses, to find the supply lines anyway, to make movement during daylight so costly that the trail would grind to a halt. But the enemy was relentless. Each time a battery fired and gave away its position, it would relocate within hours. Truck crews learned to time their movements between sorties. Decoy vehicles were rolled out to lure strikes, away from the real convoys. Even the jungle itself became part of the defense, dense, tangled, and unforgiving to anything without wings or tracks. And so the war in the air became a game of adaptation. Misty pilots were not just flying missions. They were playing a high-stakes chess match, with every flight revealing a new piece on the board. And with every move, the enemy countered smarter, faster, deadlier. This was not the kind of war most Americans saw on television. It was not about front lines or dramatic battles. It was fought in silent valleys and nameless hills, in the humid haze above the trail. A war of targets unseen and threats unheard, until it was too late. Yet for the Misty pilots, this was the war they chose. Not because it was safe, not because it was glorious, but because it mattered, because somewhere beneath that canopy, another truck was inching south, another anti-aircraft battery was waiting to fire, and another Misty pilot was needed to find them first. And so they flew into the teeth of the defenses, knowing that behind every shadow, every clearing, every suspicious patch of jungle, something was watching and ready. They say war changes a man, but in the Misty Squadron it did not just change them, it followed them. Long after the engines cooled and the uniforms were folded away, something remained. A sound, a face, a moment. Because flying with Misty meant more than facing danger. It meant watching your friends vanish into it. The Misty pilots lived by a bond forged at 400 knots, barely skimming the treetops, dodging tracer fire and threading the needle through radar-guided hell. But that bond was more than professional. It was survival. You trained together, briefed together, flew together. You knew the tone of each other's voice, the rhythm of their fear, the subtle shift in language when something was wrong. And then, one day, the voice went silent. Loss was not abstract. It did not come in casualty reports or press releases. It came in pairs, 2 pilots in a jet, one moment guiding strike fighters over a hidden convoy, the next, a burst of flak, a radio scream, then nothing. Sometimes the plane exploded midair. Sometimes it spiraled into the jungle. Sometimes it disappeared without a trace. And that was the hardest part, not always knowing. Because sometimes the worst fate was not death. It was not knowing what had happened to your friend. No parachute spotted, no beeper signal, no radio call, just silence and the haunting thought, are they alive down there, wounded and hiding, waiting for rescue that would never come? One pilot remembered his last mission with a friend from high school. Two rival schools, now two warriors in the same cockpit. They had joked during the briefing, just another day, another truck park, another flight. But something went wrong. The jet went down over the Gulf, the engine failing just before they made it to safety. They ejected. One was picked up. The other, si parsmai, was not. And the survivor would replay that moment again and again, wondering if he could have done anything differently. Another Misty pilot told the story of crawling into his aircraft with a crew member determined to set a record for most Misty missions flown. The mood had been light, the danger routine. But war does not care about milestones. Over the jungle, they were hit. One went out over the water, one did not. And the man who came back could not shake the feeling that it should have been him. There were names that disappeared from the duty board. Pilots who simply never returned. Some were confirmed captured, their fates known through grainy photographs or intercepted reports. Others were listed as MIA, their families left in limbo for years. And for those who flew on, each missing name was a ghost in the debriefing room, a memory whispered during the quiet moments. Before takeoff, the Misty pilots were tough. They had to be. They flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war, hunting targets in heavily defended areas, deliberately drawing fire to protect the strike aircraft behind them. But even the toughest could not outrun grief. Some masked it with humor, others buried it deep, but all of them carried it. After every mission, there was a ritual. Land, debrief, assess the damage, review the tape. But when a pilot did not come back, that ritual broke. The debriefing seat sat empty. The damage report did not list shrapnel or engine fires. It listed a name, a call sign, a date. And a hole opened up in the squadron that no new arrival could ever fill. The cost of Misty was not just the jets that did not make it home. It was the sleepless nights, the moments of silence when laughter used to be, the photo on the wall that used to smile back. Pilots would walk past the ready room and glance at a chair, remembering who used to sit there. They would hear a certain phrase, and their stomach would twist, because the men who flew Misty were not just teammates, they were brothers, bound not by blood, but by risk, by purpose, and by the knowledge that every time they took off, there was a chance they would not return. And yet, the missions continued. Because that is what Misty was. It was sacrifice stitched into every sortie. It was courage laced with loss. And for many, it was the place they found both their strength and their sorrow. Years later, during reunions or interviews, Misty veterans would speak of their fallen not with bravado, but with reverence. Some could not bring themselves to say the names aloud. Others told the stories so the memories would not fade. And always, underneath the words, there was a thread of pain that had never quite healed. They remembered the sound of flak, the flash of smoke, the silence on the radio. They remembered the final glimpses, the chute not opening, the beeper never activating, the last joke before wheels up. They remembered looking down from the cockpit, knowing a friend was down there, hoping, praying, waiting, and they remembered what it felt like to leave that friend behind. In the end, Misty was not just about the missions, or the innovation, or the bravery. It was about the people, the ones who made it home, the ones who did not, and the invisible weight that each pilot carried etched not into medals or records, but into memory, into dreams, into the quiet moments when the roar of engines faded and only the echoes remained. The Misty pilots flew through danger with courage and precision. But above their roaring engines loomed a silence more frustrating than enemy fire, an invisible ceiling imposed not by weather or terrain, but by politics, as they scanned the jungles and ridgelines of Route Pack 1, risking their lives to identify critical supply routes and truck convoys. A different kind of war was being fought thousands of miles away in offices, on typewriters, in quiet conference rooms inside the White House. And that war had rules that made little sense to those in the cockpit. From the early stages of the conflict, the air war in Vietnam had been tightly micromanaged. Targets were not chosen based on tactical logic or real-time intelligence. Instead, decisions about where and when to strike were filtered through layers of bureaucracy, often ending with civilian advisors and political staff who had never set foot in a fighter jet. The Joint Chiefs might have had opinions, and theater commanders might have submitted target lists, but final approval came from Washington. It was called gradualism, a strategy meant to apply pressure on the North Vietnamese, slowly, cautiously, without triggering a larger war. But to the men flying over the jungle, gradualism felt more like hesitation. The Misty pilots knew where the real pressure points were. They could see the convoys, the fuel depots, the bridges that connected life to war for the enemy. They flew missions that mapped the network inch by inch. They knew which targets, if hit, could choke the flow of supplies. Yet many of those sites were marked off limits, not because they were not military, but because hitting them might upset the political balance. High-value targets like power plants, dams, and ports were specifically excluded from strike lists. In the name of avoiding escalation, particularly with China, the most strategically significant infrastructure in North Vietnam was left untouched. The Misty Squadron was ordered not to strike those sites, even when they knew that taking them out could change the course of the conflict. And this restriction bred a frustration that was hard to shake. Imagine flying through heavy anti-aircraft fire, dodging missiles, watching your comrades go down not to disable key enemy resources, but to chip away at truck convoys in the jungle. The Misties were never afraid of the mission, but many questioned why the mission was not allowed to go far enough. They saw how the enemy adapted, how the trail morphed, repaired, shifted. And yet the places where the supplies originated, the ports where Soviet ships unloaded, the rail hubs that funneled materials south, remained untouched. It was not just about strategy. It was about control. Within Vietnam, operational command was supposed to be joint Army and Air Force, working together under a unified structure, but in practice, the Army dominated. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam MACV, was run by Army generals, and key decisions about air operations were made with a ground war mindset. Close air support took priority, while strategic interdiction, the kind of work Misty pilots specialized in, was often marginalized or misunderstood. The Air Force lobbied hard to get more influence. They wanted one of their own to be named Deputy Commander of MACV. That never happened. The top leadership remained Army, and the air campaign remained limited. Even within the theater, there was often tension between what the pilots saw and what the intelligence briefings concluded. Misty pilots would return with photographic evidence, with hours of reconnaissance data, with real-time information about enemy movement, and still, the next day's mission would be dictated by decisions made far above their heads. Sometimes, the restrictions were so specific it felt surreal. A particular bridge might be targeted, but only on odd-numbered days. A convoy route could be attacked, but not if it passed within a certain distance of a religious site or a dam. Even altitude and flight paths were occasionally dictated from afar. It was a war of constraints, fought by men who had trained for flexibility, instinct, and initiative. To the Misty pilots, this top-down approach created a sense of fighting, with one hand tied behind their back. The enemy, meanwhile, had no such limitations. They moved supplies day and night. They fortified routes. They built decoys. They learned the rhythms of American air power and adjusted accordingly. And yet, those with the best chance of disrupting this network, the pilots who flew low, marked targets, and understood the terrain, were often kept from doing so fully. The frustration was not just tactical. It was moral. These were men who risked their lives every day, who volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the war, who saw their friends shot down and captured. To be told that their sacrifice was being diluted by policy decisions they had no say in, that was the wound that never quite healed. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, Misty veterans would speak of this conflict within the conflict. They did not blame one side of the political aisle or the other. They simply remembered the feeling of watching a crucial target pass beneath them, knowing it could change the war, and knowing they were not allowed to act. In war, every second counts. Every truck that makes it through the trail might mean another ambush, another firefight, another fallen Marine. And so, to the Misty pilots, the question was never just tactical. It was personal. They flew to protect the men on the ground. They flew to win. And all too often, they flew knowing the full weight of what they were not allowed to do. That is the paradox of Misty, a unit built on daring and innovation, flying at the edge of possibility yet restrained by decisions made oceans away. A story of heroism not just in action, but in restraint. Not just in what they did, but in what they were willing to do, had they only been given the chance. They were not many. In fact, only 157 pilots ever wore the Misty patch. But in the skies over North Vietnam, they flew like giants. Their numbers were small, but their mission immense to fly low and fast, to find the hidden enemy, to mark targets not just with rockets, but with their courage, their instincts, and sometimes with their lives. Each Misty pilot was hand-picked, rigorously trained, and utterly committed, not by orders, but by choice. These were volunteers who willingly stepped into one of the most dangerous roles in the Vietnam War. They flew, knowing the odds, over 30% would be shot down. Some would be captured. Some would never come home. And still, they raised their hands, strapped into their jets, and launched into the unknown. Why? Not for medals or glory. Not for recognition. Most could not even talk about what they were doing. Misty was a classified operation, its existence whispered even among fellow pilots. But what they did, day after day, mission after mission, was push the limits of what air power could do. They pioneered a new kind of combat role, Fast FAC's forward air controllers in jet aircraft, darting through enemy skies at high speeds to guide strike teams with pinpoint accuracy. They turned low-level flying into an art, target marking into a science, and survival into a mindset. They developed what became known as Misty Eyes, a sharpened ability to spot enemy trucks camouflaged among trees, to detect movement where none seemed to exist, to read the trail like a hunter, tracking game. They learned to outsmart anti-aircraft guns, dodge SAMs, and call in strikes with near-perfect precision. But perhaps more than anything, they learned to depend on one another. In a world of radio static, flak bursts, and political red tape, their trust in each other became their strongest weapon. And yet, despite all they accomplished, the Misty story is not one of triumph in the traditional sense. They did not get to change the war on their own terms. The targets they knew could cripple the enemy's logistics were often off limits. The larger strategy was not theirs to decide. And for every mission flown, there were too many that ended with silence. No radio, no parachute, no goodbyes. Still, they flew. They flew for the infantry squads waiting for air support. They flew for the pilots who never returned. They flew because someone had to do the hard, dirty, precise work that others could not or would not. And because of that, they became legends not just for their bravery, but for the heart they carried into battle. When the war ended, Misty was disbanded. The jets were retired. The maps were folded. The call signs went quiet. But the legacy did not fade. It lived on in the stories told at reunions, in the names carved into black stone, in the way future generations of pilots were trained. Misty became a chapter in history not just in Vietnam's war, but in the evolution of air combat itself. Today, when we think of innovation in warfare, of missions that required not just skill but soul, we remember them. When we honor those who gave all, we remember those who gave quietly, whose sacrifices were not announced on television. but whispered among those who knew what it meant to fly Misty. So as we close this chapter, take a moment to remember the 157, not just for the number of missions flown or the aircraft lost, but for what they represented: resolve, sacrifice, brotherhood, and excellence. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most daring and remarkable air units in history. If this story moved you, if you learned something new, or if you simply want to help preserve these legacies, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that matter, stories that deserve to be remembered. And now, as the engines cool and the stars come out over a quieter sky, we wish you peace, reflection, and rest. Good night.